For generations, the story of Maori origins sounded settled. Canoes, Hawaii, arrival. But when scientists looked inside the bones of the earliest ancestors in Aotearoa, they found something far bigger. Not one voyage, but the final chapter of migration story that had already crossed half the Pacific. Because when researchers began testing ancient DNA from some of the earliest known ancestors in Aotearoa, the results did not simply confirm what everyone thought they knew. They complicated it. They widened it. They suggested that the people who became Maori were not the end point of a simple journey from one place to another, but the living continuation of a far older, layered human story written across thousands of islands, multiple ancestral worlds, and one of the greatest voyages ever undertaken. The shock was not that Maori came from Polynesia. The shock was how much history was already inside Polynesia before the first waka ever reached Aotearoa. For generations, the conventional explanation was straightforward. The ancestors of Maori were East Polynesian voyagers who arrived in New Zealand in the late 13th century. In older schoolbook history, this was sometimes compressed into the famous idea of a single great fleet, a neat image of coordinated canoes arriving as one founding event. It was memorable. It was clean, and for that reason it lasted. Later scholarship began to dismantle that version. Historians showed that the Great Fleet story had been shaped and simplified by colonial-era interpretation. Archaeology, radiocarbon dating, and closer readings of oral tradition pointed instead toward multiple voyages, not one dramatic convoy frozen in myth. The broad scientific view shifted. Aotearoa appears to have been settled deliberately by Polynesian navigators from East Polynesia, likely in the late 1200s, arriving in different waka at different times. That already changed the old map. But even this newer map still felt fairly linear. East Polynesia to New Zealand, homeland to destination, voyage completed, reasonable, elegant, incomplete. Because even before DNA entered the scene, there were signs that the first settlers did not fit the simple version as neatly as expected. At Wairau, one of the oldest and most important archaeological sites in New Zealand, the evidence felt unusually close to the beginning. The site carried the unmistakable atmosphere of first arrival. Early burials, tools, ornaments, and traces of a people living at the edge of a new world. Archaeologists recognized material culture that looked deeply East Polynesian, even tropical in character, as if the memory of older island lifeways had not yet faded. But Wairau did not look like the aftermath of a tiny accidental landing. It looked bigger than that, more organized, more connected. Some researchers began to argue that the permanent settlement of New Zealand may have involved a substantial planned migration rather than a handful of castaways or a slow demographic trickle. The archaeological signature appears suddenly and widely in the early 14th century. That matters. It suggests intent. It suggests knowledge. It suggests communities prepared to move, not just survivors drifting into history by chance. Then another anomaly emerged. Isotope studies of individuals buried at Wairau indicated that not everyone there had grown up in the same place. Some seemed to have spent childhood in geologically different regions. Their diets varied. Their life histories varied. One interpretation is that this community included both founding migrants and highly mobile people moving through an expanding world. Even before genetics, the site was whispering something unsettling. The first New Zealanders may not have been one uniform group at all. And then the genome arrived. When scientists extracted ancient mitochondrial DNA from human remains at Wairau, they were not just testing ancestry in the modern popular sense. They were reading one of the deepest archives human beings carry. Mitochondrial DNA, passed through the maternal line, can preserve clues about population history, relatedness, and migration. Y chromosome evidence can illuminate paternal lines. Autosomal DNA, spread across the wider genome, offers a broader picture of ancestry as a whole. These tools do not function like a time machine, but sometimes they act like one. The first major revelation from Wairau was subtle, but devastating to any overly simple origin story. Among 4 early individuals whose complete mitochondrial genomes were recovered, 3 did not share a recent maternal ancestor. In plain English, these people were not just one tight-knit maternal family group. They represented multiple maternal lineages. That matters more than it sounds like it does. Because if the founding population had been extremely small and narrow, you might expect less diversity. Instead, researchers found more maternal diversity than expected in some of the earliest known settlers. The evidence suggested these pioneers were drawn from a broader population. Families, lineages, social depth, not a single bloodline carving its way into an empty land, but a more complex human movement. The old story did not collapse. It widened. And if stories like this interest you, subscribe, because some of the most important chapters of human history were never really lost. They were just waiting for the evidence to catch up. But the deeper complication came when ancient Maori evidence was placed inside the larger genomic history of Polynesia itself. For a long time, Polynesian origins were argued through competing models. One emphasized rapid movement from an ancestral Austronesian world linked to island Southeast Asia. Another emphasized deeper mixing with peoples of Near Oceania, including Papuan-related populations. Different kinds of DNA seemed to tell different stories. Maternal lines pointed one way. Paternal lines pointed another. The result was not clarity, but friction. Across Polynesia, mitochondrial DNA was found to be overwhelmingly associated with Asian-related ancestry, while Y chromosome patterns showed much stronger Melanesian or Papuan-related signals. Later genome-wide studies suggested that, overall, Polynesian ancestry reflected a mixture, mostly Asian-related ancestry, but with a significant Papuan-related component as well. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal that the ancestors of Polynesians, and therefore the ancestors of Maori, had already passed through an ancient zone of contact, admixture, and social complexity long before Aotearoa entered the story. In other words, by the time the first waka sailed south into the colder waters of New Zealand, the people on board were already the heirs of an older human meeting. One lineage alone could not explain them. That changes the emotional structure of the story. Because instead of imagining Maori origins as a clean arrow drawn from one island homeland to another, the evidence suggests a layered formation. Austronesian-speaking voyagers moving through island Southeast Asia, encounters in Near Oceania, Papuan-related ancestry entering the picture, founder effects in remote islands, new communities forming, branching, sailing onward, not one beginning, several thresholds. Researchers have proposed a few broad ways to explain this complexity. One framework emphasizes admixture before eastern Polynesia was settled. The idea that the ancestral population that later expanded eastward had already become a blended Pacific people in western island regions. Under this interpretation, Maori ancestry preserves a deep synthesis form before the final eastward expansions. A second framework focuses on serial founder events. In this model, each voyage into more remote islands carried only a subset of the genetic diversity of the previous population. Over time, that creates the strange telescoping effect. Geneticists can detect variation narrows, some rare lineages are lost, and others become unexpectedly common. The further out the migration spreads, the more distinct the population history becomes. A third framework highlights that culture and genes do not always move together in simple ways. Language can spread through contact. Prestige can spread through voyaging networks. A people can become culturally unified without being genetically uniform. So when scientists reconstruct origins, they are not uncovering purity. They are uncovering process. And that may be the most important distinction of all. Because one of the biggest mistakes in popular history is assuming that a people must have one source, one birthplace, one untouched line. Human populations do not usually work that way. They move, merge, separate, absorb, remember, forget, and begin again. The landmark evidence that pushed this conversation further came not only from ancient DNA in New Zealand, but from broader genomic studies across Polynesia. One major study of eastern Polynesians in the Leeward Society Islands found evidence that their ancestry was itself mixed, combining substantial island Southeast Asian-related ancestry with Papuan-related ancestry that likely entered the story well before the settlement of eastern Polynesia. The findings suggested eastern Polynesia was not the product of a single uncomplicated movement from Samoa outward, but part of a more intricate network of migrations and interactions. Another large genomic study mapped the branching sequence of settlement across Polynesia and found evidence of serial founder expansion spreading through key island groups in stages. The details of that branching matter, because they show that eastern Polynesia was not just a destination. It was a living corridor of movement, splitting and re-splitting as navigators pushed farther into the ocean. That is the world from which the ancestors of Maori emerged. Not an isolated canoe tradition floating in legend, an entire migratory civilization. And then the twist becomes impossible to ignore. The deepest surprise in ancient Maori DNA was not that it proved the old story false. It was that it exposed how small the old story had been. Not Maori came from one place, but Maori descend from people whose history had already been layered across half the Pacific. Not a single origin, a chain of origins. Not a population outside history. A population carrying some of the most sophisticated migration history on Earth. Even the first settlers in New Zealand, buried more than 700 years ago, seem to reflect that complexity. Their maternal diversity suggests a broader founding population than expected. Isotopic evidence suggests mobility and differing childhood origins. Archaeology suggests deliberate settlement rather than accidental arrival. Oral traditions, once flattened into a colonial myth of one fleet, begin to look more interesting when read beside this evidence. Not as literal schoolbook diagrams, but as memory traces of repeated voyaging, kinship, departure, return, and settlement. Science did not erase tradition here. It made the human scale of it harder to ignore. And there is something else. Something even larger. Aotearoa was among the last major habitable lands on Earth to be settled by humans. That means Maori history begins very recently in one sense, only around the late 13th century in permanent settlement terms, but also carries extraordinary depth, because those arrivals were the final visible edge of a much older expansion. The canoes that reached New Zealand were arriving late in one geographic story and very late in a global one. They were carrying technologies, knowledge systems, genealogies, and ancestry layers formed over immense distances. By the time they arrived, they were not primitive settlers at the edge of the world. They were masters of it. That is why the DNA matters. Not because it diminishes identity by dissolving it into percentages or pathways. And not because it replaces Waka Papa with laboratory language, but because it shows, with increasing clarity, that the people who became Maori belong to a human story far grander than the simplified versions once taught. A story of navigation beyond sight of land. A story of communities strong enough to move whole worlds with them. A story in which the genome preserved what history, for a time, forgot. Picture the moment. A canoe cuts through southern Pacific water under a cold night sky. Behind it lies an ocean already crossed in stages by ancestors who had sailed from island Southeast Asia into near Oceania, into the Central Pacific, into the Far East, through generations of branching worlds. Ahead lies a coastline no human community has yet permanently claimed. Wind and woven sail, salt on skin, memory carried not in books, but in stars, chants, names, lineages, and practice skill. Then land, not tropical lagoon, not reef-ring familiarity, a different world, longer winters, giant birds, vast rivers, forests breathing in a colder light, and still, they came prepared enough to stay. When you think about Maori origins that way, the phrase, where do they come from, starts to feel too small. The better question may be, what histories had already converged inside them by the time they arrived? That is what the DNA has forced historians to confront, because the data suggests the first New Zealanders were not a biological footnote at the end of Polynesian expansion. They were participants in its final great act. Their ancestry had already been shaped by older meetings, older migrations, older bottlenecks, older decisions made on islands thousands of kilometers away. The genome did not discover that Maori were somehow less distinct than once believed. If anything, it revealed why they are so historically extraordinary. They stand at the end of one of humanity's most ambitious migration sequences, and they preserve within that position the memory of everything it took to get there. Of course, not every question is settled. Scientists remain cautious. Ancient DNA in the Pacific is difficult to recover. Sample sizes are limited. Modern populations carry later history, including colonial admixture and demographic disruption, that must be carefully untangled from deeper ancestry. Some migration routes remain debated. Some timings may still shift as new evidence appears. The map is better than it was, but it is not complete. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the wonder. Because real history is rarely a clean line. It is a coastline seen through fog, becoming visible only in pieces. And maybe that is the most powerful lesson in all of this. For centuries, people have tried to force human populations into simple boxes. Pure origins, fixed races, singular beginnings, one-to-one maps between identity and place. But ancient DNA keeps returning with the same quiet correction. Human beings do not fit those diagrams for long. We are mixtures with memory. We are routes as much as roots. We are inheritances layered by movement. The Maori story now stands as one of the clearest examples. What once looked like a straightforward migration from East Polynesia to New Zealand now appears as a final expression of a much deeper Pacific formation. The accepted story was not exactly wrong. It was just too narrow. It described the last leg and mistook it for the whole journey. But the whole journey is astonishing. It runs through ancestral Asia, through island worlds, through ancient encounters in Oceania, through Eastern Polynesian branching networks, through bold navigators who cross impossible distances, and finally into Aotearoa, where new people rooted themselves in a new land without losing the depth of the ocean behind them. That is what the scientists found. Not a contradiction of Maori identity, a revelation of its scale. And, if you want, more stories where science rewrites the map without shrinking the people inside it, let me know in the comments which population I should cover next. Because the past is not getting simpler. It is getting deeper. And somewhere inside bone, blood, language, and memory, the old world is still speaking.